Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of the press. Today, I end my official visit to Sri Lanka, which I carry out at the invitation of the government from 18 July. I would like to start by thanking the government of Sri Lanka for its full cooperation before and during the visit. I was honored to meet with the ministers of Foreign Affairs, of Labor, and of National Integration, Official Language, Social Progress, and Hindu Religion Affairs, as well as the Attorney General. I was also able to exchange views with the governor of the northern and southern provinces, a number of government departments, including representatives from the Ministry of Defense, Labor, National Integration, Official Language, Social Affairs, Finance, the Board of Investments, the Army, Air Force, and Police. I'm also thankful to the Speaker of Parliament, the Chief Justice, and member of public institutions like the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, the Office on Missing Persons, the National Police Commission, and the Election Commission for sharing their views with me. I wish to express my gratitude to the UN Resident Coordinator and the Human Rights Advisor in her office, and to the UN country team for their support, and to other international organizations. Most importantly, I wish to thank all members of the Sri Lanka civil society, non-government organizations, associations, trade unions, protesters, and women workers who bravely met with me and recounted their experience on what it means defending human rights in the country today. Sri Lanka civil society, with its courage, persistence, vibrancy, and professionalism, is an essential pillar to continue the strengthening of democracy institutions, and its continued involvement must be nurtured moving forward. I would also like to take this opportunity to highlight the constructive cooperation of the government of Sri Lanka with the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism, in line with its international obligations and with the special procedure, in particular, to whom the government extended a standing invitation. I commend that many of my colleagues, mandate holders, 9 since 2014, and 2 more agreed for 2018, had the opportunity to conduct a visit at the invitation of the government over recent years. My work built on there. What are the democratic gains that I find in my reports, or what I noticed on the ground? In the past 4 years, Sri Lanka had made great strides with regard to the democratization of the country. A notable watershed moment in this process was the introduction of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed in Parliament by a 2/3 majority on 28 April 2015. The amendment introduced a number of measures designed to strengthen the democratic character of the country, including the reduction of the executive power of the president, and the limitation of the office itself. The amendment also introduced provision for the reintroduction of the Constitutional Council and for the delegation of power to the Constitutional Council with regard to the approval and designation of members to a number of independent commissions and institutions. Furthermore, the amendment introduced a right to access information, an invaluable contribution towards democratic transparency in the country. All of these measures have created more enabling environment for the protection of human rights and the right to peaceful assembly and association. Everywhere I went, I heard repeated pride for unrelenting work of the Human Rights Commission, which now hold an A status according to the Paris Principle in defense of all rights for all. With regard to the transitional justice following the Civil War, I commend the government on its establishment of two key institutions, the Office of Missing Persons in 2016 and the Office for Reparation in 2018. These two institutions are of the utmost importance in promoting reconciliation in the country, and I urge the government to provide its vital support to their endeavors and to continue on the path towards the full implementation of transitional justice mechanism. I wish to stress the importance of consolidating the democratic gain that the country has achieved, especially through the bolstering of its above-mentioned institution and commission, ensuring in the law safeguards to ensure their continued operation and the fortification of their independence. I also take note of Sri Lankan promising and continued economic growth and impressive progress with regard to its socio-economic and human development indicators, which are among the highest in South Asia. Since the end of the Civil War, poverty has drastically reduced, and the role of civil society organizations in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal was raised a number of times during my visits. Regarding to the freedom of peaceful assembly, I found that the legal framework governing the right to freedom of peaceful assembly is comprehensive, although scattered in different sets of law and regulation, which seems to be interchangeably enforced. Some of these laws and regulations have, however, been used to unduly restrict these rights. These restrictions seem more frequent in the north and east of the country. In addition, I heard numerous accounts that enforcement of this legislation can be biased according to who the organizer of the protests are or who those who objects are, for example. While noting the considerable effort undertaken in transforming the police force into a well-trained and community policing force since the end of the Civil War, the approach of the police in managing assembly seems to rest on the negative perception that protests and demonstrations are generally a nuisance and should be prevented instead of being treated as a fundamental right inherent to every person. Article 77 of the Police Ordinance established that protests are subject to a notification procedure requiring organizers to notify the local police of their intention to hold protests 6 hours in advance. In the absence of notification, organizers may be found guilty of an offense. The same article allows police officers of a certain rank in the interest of public order to give direction prohibiting a demonstration or imposing on the person or persons organizing or taking part in the demonstration such conditions as appear to him to be necessary. These conditions may include interdictions on the carrying of flags, banners, or emblems. Police officers can also direct the conduct of peaceful assembly in any public place, determine the routes and time frames of assemblies and other groups of 12 or more people to disperse when they have reason to apprehend any breach of the peace. This provision gives cause for concern, and they are in conflict with the international human rights standard regulating the exercise of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. I have also received reports that the Vegan Ordinance of 1841 could have a chilling effect on gathering of certain communities, including the LGBTI community. Following the Easter attack, the President declared a state of emergency, which has been extended 4 times. These regulations appear to have further limited the right to peaceful assembly. During my meetings, I heard disturbing accounts of peaceful assembly, of groups mobilizing around common concerns which were prevented from taking place or which were met with physical and verbal violence at the hands of individuals without public intervention. For example, individuals were prevented from taking part in a special prayer event at Vinayagar Temple, located in the premises of Kania Hot Water Spring in Trincomalee, when their bus was repeatedly stopped for excessive periods of time at checkpoints. When they reached the 4th and final check-in point on their journey, they were stopped and forbidden from traveling any further. Meanwhile, police obtained an injunction order from the court for public nuisance, which prevented individuals from accessing the sites. In another instance, representatives of 100 families, which are met in Kepapu Lavu, stated that a court order had removed them from their protest site beside an army barracks where they had been peacefully gathering for 782 days. They were forced to relocate to another location while the court order instructed them to assemble only in a group of a limited size and to refrain from chanting slogans, citing army security concern. The family had been gathering to demand the return of their land, which the army had occupied. While the family did not complain of any physical intimidation, they are psychologically affected by effort to demoralize them and discourage them in their struggle. While I note effort by the government to ensure the army release the land they had previously used for military purpose, it is of utmost importance that land restitution happen promptly and that peaceful protest of those still waiting be allowed to take place with no restriction. During my mission, I heard a story that mother of disappeared person and activists supporting families of the disappeared have been intimidated against organizing and participating in memorial ceremony and memorial days for those who disappeared. Further to these obstacles, the government also seems to have resorted to declaring certain sectors as essential public services in order to restrict those sector rights to strike and peacefully assembly. In this case, protests are stifled through an executive legal decision instead of engaging with the concerned community over their issues and reason for their discontent. Regarding the freedom of association, Sri Lanka has a large and varied civil society with some 1,500 NGOs registered at the national level, working on diverse topics, including post-conflict rehabilitation and reconciliation, disappearances, women's rights, LGBTI inclusion, land rights, environmental, natural resources, freedom of expression, minority rights, corruption, development, and education. More NGOs exist still at the local level, encompassing a similar variety. I also notice a most promising trend at the local level, with organizations increasingly gathering themselves into community consortia, pooling knowledge and mutual support in order to create a strong and vibrant civil society culture. I'm happy to note the recent addition of an online registration procedure for NGO, which simplifies the process into a number of steps which can be followed in an online registration form. It is encouraging to note the recent transfer in competencies for the NGO Secretariat from the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of National Integration, Reconciliation and Social Progress. The nomenclature of the ministerial oversight in itself demonstrates the evolution of the narrative regarding civil society from an association which threats to national security to an understanding of the role of civil society in the strengthening of democracy process, including inclusion and the rule of law. In 2018, a new draft piece of legislation regarding the operation and registration of NGO was introduced. However, due to widespread criticism from civil society, the bill was shelved. In a promising turn of affairs, the Ministry of National Integration, Reconciliation and Social Progress put the drafting of a replacement bill in the hand of civil society, demonstrating a collaborative and consultative disposition towards civil society on the part of the governments. But in order to register an NGO at the national level, approval is conditional upon prior receipt of security clearance from the Ministry of Defense, demonstrating that the security narrative regarding NGO has not yet been set aside. Furthermore, in cases where security clearance is not provided by the Ministry of Defense, registration is refused. In instances where security clearances is withheld, reasons for refusal are allegedly not provided, and there is no avenue for appeal of the decision. Regarding the trade unions, Sri Lanka has a long history of strong trade unions. However, following the opening of the country to economic liberalization in the late 17th, the strength of trade union has diminished, and workers, especially those involved in informal employment, have found it increasingly difficult to exercise their labor rights. Obstacles to freedom of association have been particularly reported in free trade zones where intervention of the Department of Labor have been limited. Workers in free trade zone are especially vulnerable, as most have migrated long distance from their hometown in search of employment and live in lodging provided by the employers themselves. While the right of union in this area is recognized on paper, in practice, it is extremely difficult. Although the protected and devastating war ended a decade ago, deep-set ethnic and religious divide persists in the country. In addition, the failure of Sri Lanka to implement comprehensive security sector reform since the end of the conflict has meant that the mindset of security forces has remained extremely apprehensive. I'm very concerned at the numerous accounts I receive of surveillance, including online surveillance, used to monitor the activity of the civil society sector and intimidate those protesting peacefully for their demand to be heard. Surveillance seems to be particularly prevalent in the north and east of the country and seems to have increased following the Easter Sunday attack. Indeed, before, during, and after my consultation with civil society, participants reported receiving intimidation phone calls, demanding information on other participants, topics discussed, and route plan. I was personally witness to this surveillance. I'm also alarmed by the high level of the hate speech, both on and offline, that seems to have struck after the East Sunday attack in the country. Despite the fact that sufficient legislation is in place to effectively combat and prosecute hate speech through, inter alia, the ICCPR Act of 2007, the use of Section 3 of the Act, which criminalizes speech, which criminalizes advocates for national, racial, or religion hatred leading to or inciting discrimination, hostility or violence has been used to target minority community, while highly publicized instances of hate speech within the majority community have remained largely unpunished. I also provided in this preliminary assessment some of the key recommendations. Sri Lanka has made significant strides over the last 4 years with regard to the democratization of the country and the enjoyment of human rights of those under its jurisdiction after a dark period in its human rights records. This progression has been marked by a significant opening of civic space, the reform of state institutions, and earnest step towards transitional justice and reconciliation. It is, however, necessary for the government to ensure that the gains that it has made with regarding to democratization and reconciliation are not undermined. By the discriminatory application of legislation, the continued state of emergency, extremism, or the propagation of hate speech among the public, both online and offline. I'm indeed daunted by the widespread fear of setback to these democratic gains, which has been expressed to me by all sectors of the society. It is important that the country's political leaders do not dismiss the people's desire for peace, freedom, rule of law, and democracy, and do not undermine the progress that has been hard fought for, particularly in the run-up to upcoming elections. While the legislative model that Sri Lanka maintained for the exercise of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association is largely favorable for the enjoyment of these rights, consistent report that we have received aver to the fact that in practice such legislation is not applied, is unequally applied or instrumentalized towards a use other than its intended use in a discriminatory fashion. It is imperative that the government make use of the comprehensive legislation that it has and the independent institutions which are designed to facilitate the exercise of human rights, including the courts, in order to ensure that all human rights are enjoyed by all those under its jurisdiction. It is furthermore important that the government act to address the root causes of protests dealing head on with the issue raised by participants in the course of their demonstration. I recommend equally that the government take steps to identify gaps in legislation which may allow for its discriminatory use and make concerted effort to close these gaps. In a similar vein, following the testimonies that I have received while traveling throughout the country, I am of the opinion that security sector reform will go a long way in combating unnecessary surveillance of civil society and building trust among communities. With regard to legislation, the Prevention of Terrorism Act remains as the very least problematic for the enjoyment of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. However, equal concern has been expressed by civil society over the content of its potential successor, the Counter-Terrorism Act, while it is clear that there are legitimate security concerns to take into consideration, any law enacted with regard to counter-terrorism should be drafted in continuous consultation with civil society, who can play an important role in ensuring that any eventual law enacted is human rights compliance and address the concern of all sectors of the society, including those of security community. On the topic of the draft law, I recommend that should the government decide to press forward with the enactment of a new law regulating NGO, it should do so by using the draft law which is being elaborated by civil society stakeholders as the starting point for discussion. Similarly, on the Unified Employment Law, the government should address the legitimate concern of trade unions regarding its contents and endeavor to include union at every step during the elaboration process. In all cases, any draft legislation should be checked for its compliance with Sri Lanka international obligations. All in all, I urge the government to take the issue raised in my preliminary observation into consideration, and I underline that in this regard, my mandate remains available to the government for any advice regarding the implementation of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, technical or otherwise. Furthermore, at the government invitation, I will be happy to conduct a follow-up country visit should the opportunity arise. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to visit Sri Lanka during this critical period and look forward to continue our dialogue and discussion. My full report when I present it in June 2020 at the 44th session of the Human Rights Council. I thank you.
Attention. The statement will be made available to all of you. Mr. Voule now will take questions with regards to his missions and findings. Questions?
Sri Lanka from Sunday Times. You mentioned you had concerns regarding the new counterterrorism legislation that's being drafted, and you came up with a few examples. If the government were to request, are you in a position to offer advice on how best to bring in the trade unions and the other groups that are concerned about it and make them stakeholders to have a more discussed approach to drafting that kind of legislation?
Yes, thank you very much. As I already mentioned in this preliminary, I think for me it's important that the participatory approach, when it comes to the regulation that concerns a specific sector, it's important that the government adopt this participatory approach. And I'm happy also if the government wants to provide them with my expertise or to also advise them in a way that they can bring all of this sector together. And I hear many people saying that the only thing they are waiting is to be able to participate, to be able to contribute.
It's okay like this? Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
You have mentioned about the surveillance of the civil society activities, and if the surveillance happening in this government, which is actually branding itself as a government of good governance, what will happen if the previous government come back to power again? Will you take up this issue with the present government?
Well, I don't think I mentioned that there is violence against civil society, but I mentioned that there is still some surveillance, there's still some concern around the space that is created for the civil society work. And I noticed that the government made a lot of progress. But we are also in a situation where we still have the security sector that comes from far. So it is important to change some practice in the way that the security forces approach the protection of civil society or to approach the human rights. And I mentioned some of the few cases. It doesn't mean that civil society is completely under violence. I didn't mention that, and I don't think my report in that. But my report shows that although this space exists, there's still many instances where people were prevented to demonstrate, where police also use certain tactics to intimidate people, including the surveillance.
Yes?
Did you, the government, did you raise the issue of ICCPR being misused, right, or discriminatory used, and what was their response?
I didn't get to his point.
With the government, when you had a discussion, did you raise this question of this concern of ICCPR being discriminatorily used against certain sector of the society, and then what was their government's response to it?
Yes, indeed, before even this press conference, I have also briefing with government where I stated all of this, what I'm telling you here. It's not something that is hard, and as I mentioned, I came here in the invitation of the government to be able also to assess the situation, and I also convey to the government my assessments today.
Any questions? Any further questions or clarifications?